There is a village in Henan province where, for most of its history, the way to bury someone was to carry them down, not down a road, down a staircase cut into the face of a cliff, 720 steps, in places narrow enough that a man holding one end of a stretcher had to place his feet sideways and lean his shoulder into the rock. If you got sick in Guoliang, that staircase decided the outcome. In 1972, 13 men from the village sold their goats, bought hammers and steel chisels, and began digging a tunnel through the mountain. No engineers, no machines, no survey. It took 5 years, and it killed some of them. The question that has followed them ever since is a simple one. Why was nobody helping? This is the Guoliang Tunnel, 1,200 meters of road driven through the inside of a cliff in the Taihang Mountains, roughly 4 meters wide and 5 meters high, with about 30 openings punched through the outer wall, so the crews could throw the broken rock into open air. Cars use it today. So do buses, which is a separate problem. The version of this story you have probably heard is that 13 peasants achieved something impossible because they refused to give up. That version is comfortable, and it is wrong in exactly the place that matters. The tunnel is not a story about willpower. It is a story about arithmetic, about a specific calculation made by a specific government in a specific decade, which produced a specific answer. Build it yourself or do without. To see the calculation, you have to start with the rock. The Taihang Range runs roughly 400 kilometers down the eastern rim of the Loess Plateau, dividing the highlands of Shanxi from the flat farm country of Hebei and Henan. Seen from the plain, it does not read as a mountain range. It reads as a wall. The eastern face climbs in a series of steps, and the steps are not gentle. The reason is the rock itself. Much of the eastern Taihang is capped by a hard quartz sandstone that fractures along vertical joints. Water works into those joints, freezes, expands, and levers slabs off the front of the cliff. What that process produces over geological time is not a slope. It is a stack of vertical faces, some of them well over 100 meters from base to lip, separated by narrow terraces of debris. There is very little in between. On a normal mountain, gravity and erosion eventually build you a ramp. On this one, they build you a step. Guoliang sits on top of one of those steps, on a shelf of ground above the cliff, in what is now Mingxin in northern Henan. A few dozen households, a few hundred people, terraced fields cut into thin soil, persimmon and walnut trees, goats, medicinal herbs gathered from the slopes above. The village takes its name from a man the villagers say came here to hide. Guoliang was a peasant leader in the Eastern Han dynasty who, according to the story, retreated into the Taihang with his followers when the imperial army came after him. Whether or not he existed in the form the story gives him, the logic behind it holds. People did not settle on a cliff shelf because the farming was good. They settled there because the geography did the work of a wall, and nobody could follow them up. For most of the village's existence, there was one way in and one way out. A staircase, cut by hand into the cliff, by generations no one now can name, climbing the face in a series of shallow flights and turns. Locals call it the sky ladder. In places, the tread is narrower than a boot is long. There is no railing, and for long stretches, there is nothing on the outer side but air. Everything the village could not grow or make came up those steps on someone's back. Salt, cloth, iron tools, kerosene, roof tiles, everything the village sold went down the same way. A pig raised in Guoliang had to walk to market, and a pig that will not walk down a cliff staircase has to be carried by 2 men. The consequences were mostly invisible from below, and they were routine. Children old enough for schooling beyond what the village could give them went down the steps and stayed down, boarding in the valley and coming back at holidays. Grain that needed milling went down and came back up as flour, and the difference in weight was the only profit in the trip. A woman in a difficult labor was 4 hours from anything resembling medicine, and those 4 hours were vertical. A child who fell out of a walnut tree either recovered on the shelf or did not. When someone had to be moved, the village strapped them to a door or a ladder and carried them down in stages, resting on the wider treads, and the outcome depended on the weather, the season, and how many strong men happened to be in the village that day. The people who live there still talk about the ones who died on the way down. Weather set the terms. Rain makes quartz sandstone slick, and rain in the Taihang arrives in summer in quantity. Ice closes the upper flights for weeks. Fog removes the outer edge of the staircase from view without removing the drop, which is worse. For a substantial part of every year, the village was, in practical terms, closed. And everyone living on the shelf planned around that in the way people elsewhere plan around a commute. The county below had roads. Trucks ran along the valley floor. Guoliang could see them. But distance was never the problem here. That is the first thing that has to be cleared away, because almost everything written about this place gets it backwards. Guoliang was not far from anywhere. It was directly above everywhere. Measure it on a map, and the numbers are ordinary. The county seat sits a few dozen kilometers away across flat Henan farmland. In terms of horizontal distance, this was not a lost village in the Himalayas or a research station in the Arctic. A fit man could walk to a market town and back in a day, provided the first part of the journey did not require descending a rock face. The isolation was vertical, and it was roughly 120 meters thick. That is the first thing that does not fit from the edge of the village shelf. On a clear day, you can look down at the valley floor and see the road. It was not an abstraction. It was in sight, and it was unreachable by anything with wheels. Here is the second. Guoliang was not a place without engineering. The sky ladder is engineering. Somebody surveyed a route up a cliff, chose the line where the rock would hold a step, and cut 720 of them out of quartz sandstone with hand tools, working from ropes or from ledges, and did it well enough that the staircase was still carrying loaded men and stretchers centuries later. That staircase is the proof that the village could build things on vertical rock. It had been doing it since before anyone kept records. So when 13 men picked up hammers in 1972, they were not doing something unprecedented for their village. They were doing a larger version of what their ancestors had already done. The strangeness is not that they thought of it. The strangeness is that they were still the ones who had to. And then there is the third thing, which is the one that should stop you. Do the arithmetic on hand cutting a tunnel. In hard quartz sandstone, a man swinging a hammer against a hand-held steel drill rod advances a hole at a rate measured in centimeters per hour. And he is not cutting a tunnel, he is cutting a hole for an explosive charge. A full face of rock, 4 meters wide and 5 meters high, requires dozens of those holes, drilled to depth before a single blast moves the face forward by a meter or so. Then the rubble has to be cleared by hand and carried out. Then it starts again. 13 men, working one face in that rock, should have needed decades to cross 1,200 meters. They needed 5 years. Somewhere in the standard telling of this story, a piece of the mechanism has gone missing. Run the same arithmetic on the labor. 5 years is roughly 1,800 days, and nobody worked all of them, because a subsistence village in the Taihang has a harvest and a planting season that cannot be postponed for a road. Call it 1,000 working days generously. 1,200 meters across 1,000 days is more than a meter of finished tunnel per day, 4 meters wide and 5 meters high, cut through rock hard enough to destroy steel by a crew of 13 with no power tools of any kind. That number is not heroic. That number is suspicious. The obvious explanation for all of it is that the government simply refused. That China in 1972 was poor, that Guoliang was a village of a few hundred people during the Cultural Revolution, and that a place that small in a decade that chaotic was beneath official notice. Neglect, in other words, that is the reading. Almost every account settles on. And it is the reading, The villagers themselves are usually quoted to support. It is wrong. Or rather, it is the outline of the truth with the mechanism cut out of it. The state did not overlook Guoliang. The state had a policy about villages like Guoliang. That policy was national. It was famous. It was being celebrated on posters and in newsreels, while the 13 men were still sharpening their first chisels, and it was working exactly as it had been designed to work. Nobody came to help Guoliang, because by 1972, in that province and in that political system, sending help would have been the wrong answer to the question the village was asking. To see why, you need three things: the rock, the accounting, and the doctrine. In that order, start with the rock, because it eliminates the easy options first. There are three ways to get a road up a 120-meter cliff. You can switch back, laying the road across the slope in a zigzag, so the gradient stays drivable. You can bridge, carrying the road out into the air on piers and viaducts. Or you can tunnel. Switchbacks need a slope to sit on. The Eastern Taihang, for the reasons already described, does not offer one here. The face is close to vertical, and the material at its base is loose debris. There is no ramp to cut into, and cutting one would mean removing a substantial share of the cliff. Bridging was not available either. A viaduct climbing a cliff in the early 1970s means reinforced concrete, steel, cranes, cement plants, heavy trucks, and engineers who work in the units of those things. Every part of that list would have to arrive at the top of the cliff, and the only route to the top of the cliff was the staircase. The road is required in order to build the road, which leaves the tunnel, and the tunnel has the same trap inside it. The professional way to drive a tunnel through hard sandstone, then and now, is pneumatic drilling and blasting, compressors, generators, drill rigs, fuel, ventilation, and explosives handled by trained crews. Compressors are heavy. Generators are heavy. Diesel comes in drums. All of it, again, would have to go up 720 steps on human backs before the first professional hole could be drilled. So the engineering answer to Guoliang's problem was not difficult. It was recursive. Every solution required the thing that did not exist yet. This is the trap that every isolated settlement on a cliff eventually runs into, and it is why almost all of them stay isolated or empty out. Guoliang is interesting, precisely because it is one of the few that did not. Now the accounting, which is where the decision actually got made. Under the commune system, infrastructure money moved through county and commune plans, and those plans were built around production. A road was justified by what would travel on it. Tons of grain, tons of coal, tons of ore, the output of a mine, or a state farm, or a factory, measured and entered on a form. That was not corruption or malice. It was how a planned economy allocated things it did not have enough of. Guoliang's registered output was almost nothing. Terraced grain on thin soil, some walnuts and persimmons, goats, herbs. A few hundred people price, a cliff tunnel with imported equipment against that column of figures, and the result per head is not merely high. It is a number that no county official could defend to the level above him in a decade when the levels above him were dangerous. The road was not refused because someone in an office disliked Guoliang. It was refused because the form could not be made to balance, and a village that produces almost nothing measurable has no way to make it balance, ever, by any amount of asking. The poorer and more cut off a place was, the weaker its claim on the resources that would have made it less cut off. The system was not designed to punish villages like Guoliang. It simply had no mechanism that could ever reach them, and the villagers on the shelf had no way of knowing that the answer they kept receiving was structural rather than personal. Which brings us to the doctrine, and this is the actual answer. The organizing principle of Chinese economic policy through the 1960s and 1970s was self-reliance. It hardened after 1960, when Soviet advisors and Soviet aid were withdrawn, and the country was left to finish its own projects with its own labor. Self-reliance was not a slogan hung on the wall. It was an instruction about who was supposed to solve which problems, and it had a specific address. That address was Dazhai, a village in Xiang County in Shanxi Province on the other side of the same Taihang Range. Dazhai's fields were wrecked by flooding in the early 1960s, and Dazhai, in the version that became national, rebuilt its own terraces without state relief. From 1964, the campaign slogan was that in agriculture, the country should learn from Dazhai. Its leader, Chen Yonggui, a peasant who wore a towel wrapped around his head in every photograph, rose through the system on the strength of that story and was made a vice premier of the State Council in 1975. Read that as an instruction, and it becomes very clear. A village in the mountains that cannot farm its way out of a problem is supposed to dig its way out with its own hands, and the correct response from the state is a model to imitate rather than a budget line. And the sending equipment to Guoliang would not have been generosity within that system. It would have been off-message. The absence of help was not an oversight in the policy. It was the policy. And there is a fourth piece, which explains the timing and the method both. About 100 kilometers north of Guoliang, in the same province and the same mountain range, is Mingxin, now Linzhou. Beginning in 1960 and continuing for most of a decade, tens of thousands of peasants there cut a canal along and through the Taihang cliffs to bring water from the Jiang River in Shanxi across the mountains into their own dry county. The Red Flag Canal ran to something like 70 kilometers on its main line. It was built largely by hand. Men worked it hanging from ropes on cliff faces, and it was completed at the end of the 1960s. It became one of the most publicized construction projects in the country. Newsreels, posters, documentary film, delegations. It finished 3 years before Guoliang started. Consider what that means for a man in Guoliang in 1971. He is not looking at an abstract idea. He is looking at a finished object, a day's travel away in his own province, driven through the same quartz sandstone by people with the same tools and the same background as his own. He has almost certainly seen the newsreel. He may well know someone who worked on it, because the canal drew labor from across northern Henan for the better part of a decade. The Red Flag Canal did something else that mattered more than inspiration. It trained people. It spread hand drilling technique, blasting practice, rope work, and cliff face organization through a whole region of peasant laborers. And it did so in the exact rock formation that surrounds Guoliang. The knowledge was already local by 1972, so the men who picked up hammers in 1972 were not inventing a lunatic idea in isolation. They were copying, at village scale, a method their own province had spent 9 years refining in the same rock under the same doctrine. And that method contains the missing mechanism. The openings in the outer wall of the Guoliang tunnel are usually described as windows, and tourists photograph the view through them. They were not designed as views. They were the reason the tunnel could be built at all. Instead of driving one long bore inward from a portal, the crews cut in from the cliff face at intervals along the intended line. Each of those cuts became a new working face. With more than 24 of them, a tunnel of 1,200 meters stops being a single 1,200-meter problem and becomes a set of short bores advancing toward each other, workable simultaneously by small teams. The spoil no longer has to be carried hundreds of meters to a portal. It goes out the side, straight into the gorge, in the direction gravity is already pulling it. The alignment problem solves itself for the same reason. The tunnel is not buried in the mountain. It is a groove cut just behind the outer skin of the cliff, rarely more than a few meters from daylight, following the shape of the face. There was no need for precision surveying underground, because underground was never far away from outside. That is how 13 men and 5 years produced 1,200 meters of road, not willpower. Geometry borrowed from a canal. There is one more piece, and it is the least romantic. The tunnel was not chiseled out. It was blasted out. Hand drilling produced the holes. Black powder and later industrial explosives produced the meters. Explosives were the one input the village could not make or improvise, and they were also the one input cheap enough and light enough to carry up 720 steps. That is the whole reason the project sat on the possible side of the line. A compressor could not go up the staircase. A crate of powder could. The village head who organized it was Shen Mingxin. In the winter of 1971 and into 1972, he took the proposal around the households, and the arrangement they arrived at was that a core crew of 13 men would work the rock full-time while the rest of the village covered their fields, their animals, and their families. That second half of the deal is the part usually left out, and without it, the first half is impossible. 13 men cannot spend 5 years underground in a subsistence village unless several hundred other people agree to feed them. There was no budget, so they made one. The village sold goats. It sold herbs gathered off the slopes, and walnuts, and whatever else could be carried down the staircase and turned into cash. What that money bought was hammers, steel drill rods, and blasting powder, and it bought them repeatedly, because in quartz sandstone, both hammers and drill steel are consumables. The figures the village gives are in the order of 4,000 hammers broken and around 12 tons of drill steel worn away over the 5 years. Whatever the exact numbers, the shape of them is right. The rock ate the tools faster than the men. Sharpening was continuous. Drill steel blunts within hours against sandstone of this kind. And a blunt rod does not cut, it bounces. So somebody in the crew was always at the forge, and somebody was always carrying rods. Progress in the first year was measured in meters, not tens of meters. The men were learning the rock as they went, where it was sound, where it was jointed, and would collapse on them if a charge was placed badly, how deep to drill before the face stopped answering. Several of the openings in the outer wall exist where they do not, because the plan called for one there, but because the crew hit bad rock and cut sideways to daylight to get rid of it. Work went on through winters, on a cliff face, in a range where January temperatures drop well below freezing. The first cuts had to be made from the outside, which meant men on ropes over open air, hand drilling into a vertical wall with 100 meters beneath their boots. Once each opening was deep enough to stand in, it became a shelter, a workshop, and a chute. Men died. The village's own account records deaths from rockfall during the 5 years, and there are memorial stones on site. There is no version of this story in which the tunnel was free. The road opened on the 1st of May, 1977. The first vehicle through was a tractor, and the entire village walked the tunnel behind it. People who had spent their lives carrying goods on their backs stood inside a mountain and watched an engine do it. What happened afterwards is stranger than what happened before, and nobody in 1977 planned any part of it. For roughly the first decade, the tunnel did what it was dug to do. Goods came up on wheels, coal, fertilizer, building materials, and eventually a truck could reach the village that people had once carried pigs out of. Then, through the 1980s and 1990s, painters and photography students from the art academies in Zhengzhou and further afield started arriving, because the tunnel and the cliff and the village were, for people trained to look at such things, an extraordinary subject. Film crews followed the painters. Tour operators followed the film crews. Guoliang is now inside the Mingxin mountain scenic area. There are ticket gates. The tunnel has been widened and reinforced since 1977, and it is still narrow enough that traffic through it is controlled, because 2 vehicles cannot comfortably pass. Guest houses occupy the old houses on the shelf, run in many cases by the descendants of the households that fed the 13 men. Visitor numbers run to hundreds of thousands a year. The road that was dug so that goods could come up is now used mainly by people coming to look at the road. And the sky ladder is still there. It has been cleaned up, and railings have been added to the worst sections, and people now pay for the privilege of walking down the staircase that Guoliang spent 5 years making unnecessary. The village that could not sell a pig without carrying it now sells the memory of carrying it. Shen Mingxin lived to see it. The men who worked the face with him were photographed for decades afterwards by visitors who wanted the picture, and their account of what they did has been retold so many times by so many people with an interest in what it means that the plain version has been buried under the useful one. The plain version is that they had no road, no money, and no prospect of either, and they had seen a canal. Guoliang is famous, which has made it look unique. It is not. Cross into Lingchuan County in Shanxi on the other side of the range, and you find Jiagu, another village on the wrong side of the same cliffs, which spent roughly 30 years and several abandoned attempts cutting its own road out of the rock before finishing in the early 1990s. There are others through the Taihang and through the mountains of western Han, hand-cut cliff roads, hand-cut tunnels, villages that arrived at the same answer in the same decades because they were handed the same problem and the same instruction. That is what the cluster tells you. One village digging through a mountain with hammers is a story about 13 unusual men. A dozen villages doing it across one mountain range in one 30-year window is not a story about character at all. It is the visible residue of a system, and you can read the system off the map. The residue is being erased now from the other direction. Since the 2000s, the Chinese state has spent enormously on exactly the kind of rural access infrastructure that Guoliang was refused. Viaducts, bored tunnels, paved roads to villages far smaller and further out than this one. The same country that could not justify 1,200 meters of cliff tunnel for a few hundred people in 1972 now builds them routinely, with machines, in months. Nothing about the rock changed. So, the question from the beginning, why was nobody helping? Because there was nobody assigned to. The rock made the road expensive, the accounting made it unjustifiable, and the doctrine of the period converted that refusal into something more than a refusal. Under self-reliance, a village asking the state for a road was asking the wrong question. The state's answer was Dazhai, and Dazhai's answer was that you already have everything you need, which happened to be hammers. The 13 men were not an exception to the system that ignored them. They were the system, functioning as designed. Drive the tunnel today, and it takes about 4 minutes. The rock walls still carry the marks of hand drilling, and the light comes in through openings that exist for one reason: 13 men needed somewhere to put the broken stone, and the fastest route was sideways into the air.